So I want to talk a little bit about the data on Christian nationalism and some things I've discovered in the last few years in my research. As is obvious, American Christians are on the defense, and I think it's because their worldview is considered to not be dominant, which increases the nationalism, and as well as a false sense of being kind of persecuted because they're experiencing this religious decline, which I would argue is something that Christians have had a hand in. But the reality is that American Christians have more political power than any other people group in history. And there's some really great data points behind that I'm happy to send anybody who would be interested. I also allow my Christian values to emphasize my public concerns, in particular, justice for the marginal. But while doing that, I recognize that we live in a pluralistic, multicultural society, and I can't require or expect that everybody thinks exactly the way that I do. But we all bring these values to our public lives. A Georgetown professor named Paul Miller said, "We need to advocate for Christian principle, not Christian power." I think Donald Trump capitalized on the idea of Christian power and put that behind people's Christianity. Christians will have power, is something that he was known for saying. I really don't think, though, it's the Christianity that's causing the nationalism, because Christians who are non-white and non-American, majority Christians around the world, have quite different worldviews. Christians who are non-white in America have quite different worldviews in their public emphasis. Instead, I think Christian nationalism is caused by this very centuries of an ethno-religious identity that's formed, and this historical formation of that ethno-religious identity, similarly to where T. Homer is from in Croatia. And I look forward to hearing him talk about how this Christian nationalism led to the War of the Balkans that started the Renewing Our Minds program that he led for many years and, led to quite violent conflict. It seems clear that the offense that's rallying Christian nationalists perhaps to behave the way they did on January 6th is this sense of persecution. But regarding actual persecution, study after study shows that this particular group in the US is uniquely blind to structural and racial issues. And interestingly, that they're angered to even have them brought up, which is the nationalism. As Camila mentioned in the definition, the identification with your nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment to the interests of other nations, and in our case in America, the exclusion of other people groups within the nation. Not only is the perspective kind of self-referenced as a white perspective, we don't even know what's going on outside of the country, all of the things that Camilla mentioned, and that has proportionally gone down since Christian nationalism had started really taking root about 40 years ago. This unfortunately makes a significant overlap with white nationalists, though Christian nationalists would definitely say they're not racist. They would say racism isn't a part of it, though it seems clear that the actions on January 6th and some of the things that have been overlooked the last 4 years really have everything to do with race. But Christian nationalists would say they're colorblind. I believe this in part is related to the data that shows there is a high theological emphasis on self-enhancement and individualism in the church. If you would go through sermon after sermon in the last 20 years, that is a very big point that also will unfortunately make people justice blind. We have this extremely powerful and divisive political capital as American evangelicals, and we are unavoidably incarnated into political lives, as was Jesus. He was unavoidably incarnated into a political life. And I would say he was crucified in part due to politics. As public citizens, we do need to bring about corrective measures through advocacy and voting when government fails to fulfill its traditional accepted responsibilities, such as public safety, education, public health care, whatever, public health, whatever we can scrape up there, and infrastructure. There is no viable alternate mechanism to achieve those results. But I would say if more children are going hungry in the country than any other economically developed nation, there's a disconnect between white evangelical scriptures or the Bible and action on the streets. We've got 1 in 4 kids going to bed hungry in this country. 1 in 7 people right now in America do not have enough food to make it to the end of the month. And the public emphasis of evangelicals is a litmus test of their spiritual health and points to this learned hermeneutic, really, of individualism and authoritarianism. And authoritarianism is really what I want to talk about and end with in the last couple minutes. It's my main point and the main concern, and I think the driver behind a lot of this. Egocentric individualism and authoritarianism really go together. Data shows that when people knowingly or unknowingly ascribe to an individualistic worldview, feel threatened by an outside force, they will react with intolerance and look for leaders who support their views. Authoritarianism is specifically associated with fear, fear of change, and a preference of systems that make sense of the world. And a strong conviction of this worldview is that conventional systems of authority and government are best, even if they do not create equity for others. There's a story I really like to illustrate this point. People started researching authoritarianism post-1940s in an effort to understand some of the things that happened in World War II. And in 1987, one of the studies was looking into authoritarianism, specifically right-wing authoritarianism, although people on the extreme left can be authoritarian as well. And I'll touch on that briefly, but mostly I'm concerned with the right-wing authoritarianism right now. So they did a simulation with a nuclear war type exercise where people were divided into teams and had to make choices in how to respond with diplomacy or with aggression. It used mock NATO teams on these international exercises with co-teams that represented the Warsaw Pact. They had people that they divided from both ends of the authoritarian scale. So there would be low authoritarians and high authoritarians put into different groups. The high authoritarians consistently brought the world to the brink of complete nuclear annihilation, unfailingly, 10 times more than the low-scoring authoritarians. In similar experiments like that, the high authoritarians will usually support perceived authorities if they feel threatened in violating human rights, resorting to violence, or going to war. What's really disturbing and is that conservative white Christians or extreme Christian nationalists are the most authoritarian group in the United States. And this has been the only statistically significant characteristic that will absolutely predict voting for Donald Trump with statistical significance, is if somebody is authoritarian. And even if they're a mild authoritarian, but one of their most important issues is a fear of terrorism, you can predict they'll definitely vote for Trump. When you're full of fear, you don't have all the information and dogmatic, it's very hard to change people's minds. I just want to go through this list of, I focused a lot on this in a research project I did here in Dayton, and these are the various characteristics that include authoritarian personality. It's really kind of depressing. Authoritarian submission, aggression, conventionalism, superstition and stereotyping, preoccupation with power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, exaggerated concerns over sexuality with a likelihood of personal struggle with sexuality. In particular, that's porn addiction or misogynist violence, obedience to established authority, strong aversion to assumed illegitimate authority or fundamental traits. And again, this is research that was done 20 years ago. Improbable fears, challenges with data, tremendous self-righteousness, tremendous self-referencing. Everything is about how it makes sense within your own reference. Hypocrisy, ethnocentrism, racism, and dogmatism. Highly predisposed to follow a strong leader, ascribe to conventional values, and prejudice to any data group. So, and in all the studies that I read on this, there is like no low-hanging fruit. There's no like, well, at least they do X, that's really good. There's nothing. It's all bad. No positive outcome for families, nothing. While these are highly correlated with the far right, the extreme left, as I mentioned, can be guilty of it as well. And the reality is nobody has the right to tell anyone exactly how they should think on their values. And sometimes the extreme left is guilty of that as well. In my view, this authoritarianism is the whole thing behind Christian nationalism. And really the question it raises is, how do we change people's minds? So there has been a lot of interesting talk on unity the last few days, and some people say forget about it, but I don't think that's the solution. While talk about unity without truth is not effective, we really have to emphasize our common goals and how we're going to work together towards being a country, towards, for Christians, loving one another, protecting the marginal, actually having a great country, you know. But this contested dialogue keeps fueling misunderstanding because both sides think they're working from the same worldview, and they're not. Division is increasing, and research shows that it is mathematically impossible for the Congress to be more polarized. It is more polarized than even before we went to civil war in the 1800s. So we who are desperately concerned by Christian nationalism and how it affects the most vulnerable are less inclined to entertain unity talks. Some of us have cut off friends who've been radicalized, and really what we're doing is raging at the darkness. And unfortunately, we're often preaching to the choir in our discussions. However, there is something that can reduce authoritarianism and reduce blindness to ethnocentrism and structural injustice. And that is, there might be more than one way, but this is the proven one way, is that you have to have extended contact with an outgroup. So that means we have to keep our Christian national friends. And as difficult as it is, we have to encourage them to get to know people outside their usual friend group in an ongoing, extended fashion. There's many of us, David touched on it as well, that we either were or we know people who were more fundamentalist in our Christian views and more extreme in maybe had some of this Christian nationalism. But because of time spent with people who are not exactly like them or us as a white person, and took time to walk in other people's shoes, that is not the case anymore. The people on this call are not Christian nationals. The people talking on this call are not Christian nationals. So there's some hope. You know, it's not all doom and gloom, but it is very serious. And this problem of authoritarianism has been highlighted and discussed, you know, unfortunately, often just in academic circles. It's not really a political buzzword, but it's serious. And I would say that it's the thrust behind what we're talking about.